Hello, welcome. My name is Dawn Payne, and I have the privilege of being the chair of the steering committee of the Women's Giving Circle of Missoula County, and we want to welcome you here to our panelist presentation. This is the first time that we have done this as an in-person event. So along with having lots of opportunities for growth, you know, to learn like, oh, we'll do that different next time. Also, it just feels really important. So the Women's Giving Circle of Missoula County was founded in 2018 with the belief, I'm going to shorten this a little because we're starting a little late, but that together our collective impact increases. So our membership runs, we have $120 right now. We're in some great discussions a year. You can do $10 a month, and you can give more. And most of our members give more because we believe when we come together, we increase the volume of our voices. So we give together, we decide together, and then we benefit together because we're all a part of this greater Missoula community. So I want to thank you for coming and engaging with us and being curious. We have our lovely events chair, Jamie. I know that you didn't want me to do this, but too bad. You know, it really is a group of a bunch of we're for women and non-binary individuals is our membership, and it really is a group of humble believers in the importance of community. So it's a privilege. So I want to thank you for your leadership. This is your last year doing events. So I'm Oliver Klempt, me and Barbara Streisand are Oliver Klempt. So I'm super grateful to be here, but I don't want to suck up time because I am so stoked about our panel. But I want to introduce our moderator, who is a founding member. I saw Marcy, and I swallowed a cracker down my windpipe. It's a compliment. I was like, so happy to see you. Marcy Allen is the executive director. Is that your title? I'm not a good title person. The executive director of the Missoula Community Foundation, which the Women's Giving Circle is a program of. So we're very grateful that you're here. And we have our moderator, founding member. I am out of control on a good day, you know that. Our founding member of our steering committee, Molly. And here's the deal. When she said, oh, I didn't bring a copy of my bio because she's going to introduce our fabulous panelists. Oh, they're all there. And I went, well, all I can tell people is that you're amazing, you're fun to work with, she is smart as a whip. So I'm going to read her bio so you can learn a little more about how she uses that great wisdom and passion. So besides being really cool to hang out with, Molly is the executive director of Travelers Rest Connection. She has worked in nonprofit management, primarily in museums, oh yeah, for 30 years. She received her bachelor's degree from the University of Pennsylvania and her master's of public management from Carnegie Mellon University. She is currently the executive director of Travelers Rest Connection, a significant historic site of the Lewis and Clark expedition and the Salish Gillespie people. Molly has worked with Mr. Rogers on a children's museum exhibit, which is a cool, fun fact. Thank you for putting that in there. Now I lost my place. So she's hung out with Mr. Rogers, raised funds to support individuals with developmental disabilities. As a parent of one, actually a traumatic brain injury, I say thank you. Been a stay-at-home mom and PTO president. That's awesome. And is a survivor of sexual assault and ovarian cancer. And thank you for giving that voice. Molly is president-elect of the Destination Missoula Board of Directors and is a founding member of the Women's Giving Circle of Missoula County, a native of Pittsburgh, which we forgive her for. Molly has lived in Montana since 2006 with her husband and 2 sons, computer geeks who tolerate her love for museums, poetry, and disco music. So Molly will do our land acknowledgement and introduce our phenomenal panel. Thank you. Thanks.
Panelists, do you want to come up and have a seat so you don't have to like parade in front? That's totally fine. Thank you. All right, thanks so much for that, Dawn. I do want to start by by acknowledging that we are gathered today on the homeland of the Salish and Kellis Bay people. We are committed to respectfully sharing the history and contemporary culture of the Indigenous people who lived and traveled through this land. We learn from many Indigenous artists, elders, and organizations, and we invite you to learn from and support them as well. I also wanted to take a minute to note that we're using the term women tonight as sort of shorthand to include people who were assigned female at birth, transgender females, and non-binary people. All voices are welcome in this conversation. With that, I'm going to introduce our panel. Skye McGinty at the end there. Skye is the Executive Director of All Nations Health Center. She's an enrolled member of the Little Shell Chippewa tribe and a 3-time graduate from the University of Montana with a Bachelor and Master of Art degrees in sociology, with an emphasis in inequality and social justice, and a Master of Business Administration. Skye has dedicated her academic and career pursuits to examining and addressing the unique unmet needs of underserved communities. Skye wrote her master's thesis on low-income and first-generation college students' experiences in higher education. As an AmeriCorps Vista, Skye examined the impacts of poverty on rural youth. She also wrote the Project Beacon Grant, initiative geared towards providing comprehensive care to Indigenous sex trafficking survivors. Originally from the flatlands of northeastern Montana, Skye enjoys exploring Missoula's excellent hiking trails and public lands with her dog, Huckleberry. That's great, in her spare time. So welcome. I'm going to try to go in order here, which makes me need to pull up my phone and hopefully be able to read it. In the center is Grace Decker. Grace graduated from Brown University. Sorry, I have to do it. And has worked in the early care and education field as a preschool teacher, center director, social, emotional, and behavior coach, professional development specialist, trainer, and consultant. Since 2019, she has led the 0 to 5 Missoula initiative based at the United Way of Missoula County. She is a leading advocate for childcare and early education in Montana and has presented across the state and nationally. Grace has also served as an elected trustee with the Missoula County Public Schools since 2015 and plays a mean fiddle in the band Cash for Junkers. And finally, Mikayla Pitts. Mikayla is originally from Bakersfield, California. She was recruited in 2012 to play basketball at Little Bighorn College on the Crow Reservation, where she earned an associate degree in biology. While earning her degree, she fell in love with Montana and decided to stay. Thank you. She graduated with her bachelor's and master's degree in community health from MSU. We'll forgive that too. Mikayla is passionate about community health practices, especially outreach and community building. She loves kickboxing, reading, and writing poetry when she's not working. She has a passion for community work. Some of her activities include the BridgerCare Board of Directors and the BIPOC Advisory Committee. She is also a volunteer girls basketball coach with Gallatin High School. And this says you work with second graders? Bless you. All right. And we do need to thank MCAT, who is filming this tonight. For our members who cannot be here, MCAT is here as part of their grant program to nonprofit organizations, and we are super grateful for that. All right, I'm going to sit. And for MCAT, while we can probably all project enough for everybody to hear us, it's better for Ron's levels if we each pick up a microphone, okay? Great. Okay. As the members of the Women's Giving Circle know, we believe in informed philanthropy. We've invited panelists today because our members want to hear from people who work on issues affecting women every day. Women's issues is a hugely broad topic, and we know we can't talk about all the issues affecting women in a short amount of time. We hope to have time for some questions from the audience if our conversation doesn't touch on something important to you, but we do have a few questions to start with. And I'd like to start by inviting each one of our 3 panelists to talk briefly, highlight an area within women's issues that you're working on or that you believe should have our attention. Okay. Wouldn't just come down the line, Scott?
Oh, hello, perfect.
I'm realizing I should have sat in the middle so I didn't have to start. Thanks for being here, folks. I appreciate your attendance. When I was first approached to pick a topic related to especially Native women's issues in our world, I really struggled with what I wanted to talk about. In Native way, our matriarchs are everything to our family. We are a very matrilineal society, and so there's a plethora of different topics that I could have spoken about. The first one that came to mind, which I hope as Montana residents, this does not shock you, but there is an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous, especially Native women. But we use the term relatives now to also bring in our femme-presenting and two-spirit relatives who are also impacted by that crisis. I did want to talk about that, but I do think, especially now, that topic gets a lot of platform, especially here in Montana, which is great. And I also want to steer away from the narrative that Native people and minority people in general are just our trauma, that we are just our oppression, because that's typically what you hear about our stories, is the negative things that have happened to us. And while I think it's really important to highlight that issue, I wanted to talk about Indigenous joy tonight and Indigenous celebration, because I think that that topic does not get covered quite enough. And so I wanted to talk to you about entrepreneurialism and our Native women, and specific ways that it creates channels for our Native women to indulge in our culture and share our heritage, and also make a bag. You might know, just in this valley, there are so many creative, talented Native artists of every gender and sexual identity expression. But I would say our Native women in particular really lead that momentum. It's a way for Native women to share our culture, whether it's in beading or quilling or tanning hides, making drums, moccasins. There's really a whole crafting world out there. And it's not only a way to share our culture and our heritage, but it's also a way that paves a way for our Native women to self-sustainability and self-governance. They are able to run their own small businesses through the artwork that they are putting out into the world, which I think is really special. Again, it's a way that we're able to be connected to our ancestors, to our land, and to our people. But it's also a way that our women are able to sort of uplift themselves either from poverty or from violent situations in their home, if they're able to rely fully on themselves for their own economic sustainability. And so you'll see there are a number of different Indigenous craft markets across Missoula, especially after COVID. They've really popped up. I'm sure during COVID, there was a lot of downtime that everyone experienced. I picked up beading again during COVID just to have something to do and not make another damn loaf of sourdough bread. But you see this resurgence coming back of Native women really owning their craft and also being able to have that economic sustainability piece. And we see a lot of our Native women also passing that down to their children. There's some really excellent organizations led by Native women in Missoula who are working to create a space for Native business owners and entrepreneurs and crafters to start to learn how to do panels, to learn how to sell their wares at markets, how to price effectively, because I think we're our own biggest critic. And we might not price things quite the way that they should be. And so there's this whole movement out there that is bringing this craft and this culture back to our people in a really meaningful way. I think it is a little bit unfortunate that we have to commodify our culture in order to survive capitalism, but that is sort of the reality that we live in. But it is a really great way for our Native women to be connected to one another, to be connected to their families, and connected to our larger space in the world. And so I wanted to just touch on the ways that entrepreneurialism can really open up doors for our Native women, for their families. Again, because in Native way, we are heavily reliant on our mothers, our grandmothers, our aunties. Being able to see our matriarchs be successful in that way changes generations. I know myself, I have many aunties and my grandma who beads. And as a young child, I didn't really think much of it. But now looking back on that, all of the things that they have created, all of their art that is out in the world that also brought them sustainability for our family is a real piece of pride for me. And I feel a lot of pride in this young generation who is coming up now and being able to see that same success. And again, sharing our culture and our heritage, which I think is the most important thing we can do.
Grace, sorry. Same question. what are you working on in this realm that you would like us to put our attention towards?
Thanks. So I came up in my career first and foremost as an early childhood educator. Very young children are at the most critical period of life when it comes to brain development, development of social skills, all of the skills they need to be successful later in life. And that, in and of itself, is a really important human issue for all of us. But what happens for children during that particular period of life has particular consequences for women, both the women whose children those are and the women who care for them outside of the home. Right? So childcare has become a critical aspect of family life in the modern age. 69% of children in Montana, and that echoes the national number, have all adults available to them in the workforce. That means there's no, and that's children under the age of 6. So that means there's no one at home necessarily to care for those children. And so children need to have access to childcare. If any of you have been around a family with a child under 6 in the past 5 to 10 years, what I'm about to tell you is probably something you are already very familiar with. Childcare is hard to find. It's expensive. It's not convenient. And it's not usually of great quality when you're able to find it. Those are harsh realities that every working family is faced with. And the impacts of that are disproportionately felt in low-income communities, in communities of parents who are trying to themselves attend school or just get their careers started, and in communities of color, because the workforce in the early care and education sector is largely women of color nationwide, and that's true in Montana as well. So the work that I do is around trying to identify ways to strengthen that sector, and that's a big challenge, actually, because across the nation, what is true about the early care and education sector is that we treat it as a personal, private, family matter. We think that what happens for children before the age of 5 is that family's responsibility, which means that their zip code and the number on their tax return determine the quality of experiences that those families can often provide during that period of life. Or let's not say the quality of those experiences, because what children need in that phase of life is not actually rocket science. They need responsive caregiving from an adult who values that child and puts them first. The problem is that as a society, we've made that incredibly hard for families to do. And we've also made it incredibly hard for childcare providers to do that as well. The childcare sector has turnover of upwards of 75% annually. That means that this is a very young, very inexperienced, very poorly trained, and unfortunately, extremely poorly paid workforce, right? This work is critical, it is stressful, it is rewarding, but most people do not find that it is a field they can stay in to take care of their own family's needs. As I was coming up through my career, I worked with young children and families, and by the age of 30, I was the director of a center that was founded here in Missoula, and I'm proud that that center is still going. But at the age of 30, I was by far the most experienced person in my organization. I was the mentor with 6 or 8 years of experience. And we would never stand for that in our public schools, right? We would never stand for such a poorly trained, poorly supported workforce to care for our children. But as a nation, we've decided that we invest in children once they are 5, even though the brain research indicates that most of the capacities and the formative experiences are taking place birth to 5, right? So we have it flipped upside down. And we're actually alone among wealthy nations in how little we invest in young children and families. Most other nations who have economies that would rival ours by population are spending anywhere from 3 to 7, and in some cases 15 times as much on children between birth and 5 as we do. And Montana is the bottom of the barrel of the bottom of the barrel. Because in Montana, we are one of the only 4 states left without publicly funded pre-K. And this past year, our legislature, for the first time ever, made a state investment in our child care system to support low-income and working families to pay for child care. And that is not an investment that makes child care more available, right? It's not an investment that makes child care more convenient, and it's not an investment that makes child care of higher quality. So it's a really complex issue. There are some system solutions that are being explored at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level. But it's going to take a real lift at all of those different levels, as well as from the business community and from our K-12 education system, to really get to a place where the issue of childcare is actually less of a crisis. And I will just say one more thing about that, which is that this impacts women in a much more dramatic fashion than men. Because in response to the broken nature of this child care system, women scale back their aspirations, they turn down promotions, they turn down the opportunity to pursue job training, they leave the workforce altogether, they work part-time instead of full-time, and that family's dreams and ability to achieve are deferred because of this broken system. There are really depressing calculators you can go and look at where you can explore how much in earnings you will lose if you take even 1 year or up to 5 or 10 years out of the workforce in terms of income and promotion opportunities and savings and retirement and all of that. So this is an issue that disproportionately impacts women, and it's going to take a system solution.
Okay, here we go. So we're going to go from Grace to Mikayla, and I guess it's the same question. I'd love to hear a little bit about the work that you do and what you want us to focus a little attention on.
I prepared some notes, so just bear with me. So my work in advocacy focuses on reproductive justice, working with the Montana Racial Equity Project and a board of directors with BridgerCare has made me aware of the urgent need to mobilize around women's reproductive rights. For women of color, structural inequality, discrimination, and systematic racism has always been shown to have severe effects on health and are linked to disparities in rates of cancer, HIV, sexual transmitted infections, the mortality during pregnancy and childbirth. These disparities are linked to the social determinants of health. Social determinants of health are conditions in the environment in which people are born, live, play, work, worship, and age. Social determinants of health have a major impact on people's health, well-being, and quality of life. Social determinants of health include safe housing, transportation, neighborhoods, racism, discrimination, and violence, education, job opportunities and incomes, access to nutritious foods and physical activity spaces, polluted air and water, language, and literacy skills. Therefore, when we look at reproductive health of women of color, we need to recognize the totality of their lives. Thank you for bearing with me. Reproductive justice offers a wider perspective when advocating for reproductive health. It gives us a tool to understand the complete physical, mental, spiritual, political, social, economic well-being of women and girls. The reproductive justice framework describes how the ability of a woman to determine her own reproductive destiny is linked directly to the conditions in her community. Social issues affects a woman's right to make healthcare decisions for Black, Indigenous, and women of color. These issues include the right to have children, the right to not to have children, and the right to parent the children that they have. Because of reproductive oppression affects women's lives in multiple ways, marginalized women face multiple oppressions. A multi-pronged approach is needed to reduce barriers by addressing how they impact one another. Reproductive justice can also be used as a theory of thinking about how to connect the dots in our lives. It sends a clear and consistent message for better lives for women, healthier families, and sustainable communities. Every human being has multiple identities based on race, gender, class, religion, abilities, and other characteristics. Intersectionality is the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and oppression. It allows us to name all of these identities and understand how they interact to create a unique individual experience. Reproductive justice is based on the understanding that race, class, gender, sexual identity are not additive but integrative. Intersectional solutions require a holistic approach. For example, a homeless woman's problems will not be effectively addressed by her giving a bed in a temporary shelter, or even permanent housing. When we use a holistic intersectional approach, we ask, well, why is the woman homeless in the first place? We attempt to address the multiple root causes of her situation and not simply paying attention to the immediate pressing symptoms. All oppressions impact our reproductive lives. The intersectionality approach is both an opportunity to call to come together as one movement and the power to win freedom for all oppressed women. Advocating for reproductive justice at a grassroots levels also requires fighting against sexual and domestic violence, homophobia, HIV and AIDS, as well as substance abuse. Reproductive justice focuses on women and their communities to confront inequalities and structural power. The challenge is to integrate grassroots issues in the communities that are multiracial, multi-generational, and multi-class.
All right, so they gave me the microphone, which means that I get to ask questions. And oh, you have a microphone too, Skye. Excellent. So I kind of wanted to touch on some of my personal background with each of you because I think it will help illustrate some of the issues. In my work life at Travelers Rest State Park, I work with a lot of Indigenous educators. We have a series of demonstrators, and I wanted to kind of, this is a little off topic, but, or off what we were saying. I loved what you said, Skye, about the economic empowerment of sharing the culture. But I know that that is not necessarily the view taken by everybody in the Indigenous community. And I wondered if you could talk just for a second about different viewpoints and how we can best support Indigenous women in their efforts, and also honor the fact that there are some for whom their culture is a very personal and almost very closely held thing.
That is a great question. I've never been asked that before. I guess I want to start out by saying I can only speak for my experience. I can't even speak for my own tribe, but I am an Anishinaabe person, so my personal experience is reflective of that culture. Native people are not a monolith, so this does not go for every single Native person, and we have a very diverse intertribal community here in Missoula, so I always like to provide that caveat before I jump in. Yeah, to your point, Molly, about having different views about sharing that culture, in particular when we have to commodify earrings or regalia or hand drums, whatever that might be. There definitely is some, I would say, contention in the Native community based on our most Plains Native communities' belief that reciprocity is one of the most important values in our societies. That's reciprocity with one another and with the land in particular. That's why I always grew up, my grandma would always tell me, you don't buy sweetgrass, you don't buy sage from the store because that interrupts your relationship with the ground. The earth gave you that for free. You do not buy it, you do not sell it. And so when we're essentially commodifying our culture by selling earrings, some people take that same approach of saying, no, this is a gift. We do not measure wealth in Native communities by money. We measure it by how much we can give away to other people. You are a wealthy person if you have more than you need and you are able to take care of your community. And so there is sort of that fine line between, yes, we just have to, as Native people, figure out decolonized ways to survive in the here and now. And for a lot of, especially Native women, arts and culture is the avenue to that. But for some people, like to your point, Molly, some people do hold it very close to themselves. And there certainly are closed ceremonies out there that don't have a lot to do with art, but a lot to do with culture that Native people, again, close that ceremony. It's just for certain tribes or for certain people. But I would say, yeah, there is sort of that movement, that resurgence of bringing back art and putting it in contemporary sense instead of, back in the day, we absolutely would have traded for this. We would have given these as gifts, and we still largely do that. I mean, you'll see Native people give away all sorts of stuff at raffles, bingos. It's like our favorite thing. But there is sort of that fine line that you have to walk between honoring the Indigenous values that have been passed down to us and also trying to fit them in the contemporary sense of 2023. So I don't have a solution for that. I would say it's very, very individual. Personally, for my art, I really like to share it. I've sold it in art shows before. To me, that was, especially as a broke college student, a really nice way to be able to pay bills. But for some people, it's incredibly, incredibly personal, and you would never sell it. You would only just give it away. So I think it is very tribally specific, regionally specific, and personally specific.
Just waiting for the green light on this. I'll stop turning it off. Okay, Grace, I'd like to go back to something that you said. The message about the lack of access to and affordable childcare is pretty well known in the Missoula community. And I'm wondering if you could take a second and talk about any essential or new approaches or ways that a grant from the Women's Giving Circle can kind of move the needle. We have $10,000 and we can't give a pay raise to every child care worker in Missoula. Would that we could. So how can our philanthropy help?
Boy, that is such a great question. And that's actually a question that folks have struggled with at all levels, honestly, because the solutions that seem like affordable have no impact. And the solutions that would be impactful are like, we need a federal massive, law to pass. And everything in between, doesn't seem like there is anything in between. The kinds of solutions that people suggest often seem very much like a drop in the bucket. It's a scholarship to someone to pay for like a summer camp that covers a couple of weeks. Then what? Or it's even a larger grant to help get a childcare business started because they need like outdoor equipment or something. But then what? Now they're supposed to operate within this broken business model. And even if they do manage to keep going, and most childcare businesses close after a couple of years, then like, even if they do manage to keep it going, that's like 6 children, right? We're not like attacking the system. So what I will say is that what we've started to see happen is there's been this collective at all levels recognition that it is in fact a broken system, and that absent that huge, massive omnibus, it's going to be public school for early childhood, it's going to be childcare for all, it's going to be something like that. In the absence of that, what we're looking at is a quilt of solutions. A quilt of employer-sponsored or employer-adjacent childcare. And there are a lot of problems with employer-sponsored childcare because, my gosh, now that's where you get your health insurance, and it's where you get your maybe housing, and maybe it's where you get your childcare, and we're back to company towns, right? So there's a lot of problems there. And most companies don't want to do it because it turns out it's fabulously expensive to run an employer-sponsored childcare, right? So I'm not saying everyone should do that, but that's part of it. And then there are some solutions where it's like a co-op, and maybe, a couple businesses or a small town actually gets together. West Yellowstone is a good example of a town where all the businesses in West Yellowstone realized the only childcare had closed down. And my gosh, they better do something, because where are people's kids going to spend their day? And so a partnership between like the library and the government and all the businesses put together a co-op that made a childcare business get started. In West Yellowstone that now exists and operates. And does that solve the problem for everyone? No, but it's part of this larger quilt. And there are some things that are happening in Missoula, too. There are some expansions of existing childcare that are going on. The YMCA is doing a massive project that includes significant increase of slots. And there may be other smaller programs that would like to increase and could use a small amount of money for those slots. We at United Way are working on a project called Missoula Child Care Advantage that creates a network of independent child care businesses who can share like business operation services to help them operate more efficiently and sustainably. And that shared service network is supported by some businesses who are going to have like fast waitlist access for their employees into it. So that's how that's going to operate. That's something that we're trying out as a possible solution. None of these things are going to fix all of it, but all of them together can do some of the parts and pieces. And I would say that for someone interested in making grants in this space, I think the more you can understand about the complexity of what you're looking at, the more those small pieces can feel worth investing in, because it's clear that no one project is going to solve all of it. But it's also clear that childcare is not going to solve itself. And so sometimes seeing yourself as just part of that quilt of solutions that are being sewn together in a community until we can get to the point of a large omnibus solution, that's really, it actually does more good than you think. So.
Okay, I have a similar question for you, Mikayla. So in my introduction, thank you, Dawn, she mentioned that I'm an ovarian cancer survivor. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to be flying off to Washington, D.C. as part of my role as an advocate leader for the Ovarian Cancer Research Alliance. And we're going to be asking our congressional delegates for big sums of money for national programs to increase awareness and research funding. What is a smaller way that you can see that we can help to address the issues for women's health care, especially what you're facing right now at BridgerCare?
So I am a board member at BridgerCare, and I'm also on the BridgerCare Equity and Accountability Committee. So I don't know if a lot of people knew this, but BridgerCare took the Title X grant from the state. They won it. So they won this lump sum of money that they're in charge of. So they also created Montana Family Planning. So with that, we've been able to help other reproductive health clinics in the state. So the money now flows from BridgerCare, the Montana Family Planning, into the states. So it helps a little bit, but right now there's only 6 abortion clinics in the whole state of Montana. There's 2 fertility clinics in the whole state of Montana. And if you think about our region, so if you think about Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas, and Idaho, the only 2 states that have abortion access right now is Montana and Wyoming. Where do all these other people go? They come here. So the Montana Abortion Fund is doing the best that they can do, but they're only board ran right now. They don't have staff right now. They don't have a client advocate. So we've made a lot of progress, but we still have a lot of work to do.
I know that one of the things that, and I'm going to ask, actually, I'm going to have you pass it right on back, because I have to ask Mikayla another question. One of the things that I have learned in my role is that rates of gynecological cancers are actually increasing in women of color. And when we get on these, I'm on these Zooms nationally, I can see what's happening in big cities. And of course, what happens here is very different. Mm-hmm. But I wondered if you could talk just for a minute about the idea of intersectionality. You mentioned that before, and how, these deficits in women's health care affect communities of color in different ways.
Mm-hmm. So thinking about this idea of intersectionality, it helps us understand how different forms of discrimination intersects. Yes, abortion is available in Montana's, but they are not on the tribes because through IHS, and correct me if I'm wrong, Skye, the funding from them is federal. They cannot use that money to provide abortions. So there's a disparity there. And there's also a rise in BIPOC maternal health. There's no, or I'm sorry, I misspoke. No one's really talking about BIPOC maternal health. The only,
But he'll be back again at 6 o'clock, so just,
lost my train of thought. Mental health. Yes, I was talking about maternal health. So, but BIPOC maternal health is not a topic that's being discussed in Montana. What's also not being discussed is that yes, we're fighting for comprehensive sexual education, but in BIPOC communities that looks a lot different. We're not having conversations about, okay, so once you are pregnant, what does that look like? No one's talking about the barriers which you have to deal with the Public Assistance Office or TANF, or if you apply for WIC. No one's talking about those types of issues. And then to speak about childcare, I can't speak for Missoula, but in Bozeman, childcare is very expensive. And with the rise in wages in Bozeman right now, I mean, families can't even afford to live there.
yeah. Skye, did you want to add anything to that idea of intersectionality?
Just that IHS is federally funded. You're right. Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, especially in healthcare, intersectionality to me, and I hate to use another buzzword, but is essentially the same as trauma informed or trauma engaged. You might have heard that arranged a little differently. It's essentially acknowledging that every single person comes in with some amount of trauma, and just recognizing that they are ultimately people. And not saying like, well, why do you have diabetes or why do you have this ingrown toenail? It's why, what led to, yeah, that's a bad example. I always use that though. Yeah. But like, what are the situations in your life that led you to this situation? For Native people in particular, I mean, ever since white contact, we have had intergenerational trauma. And when we decontextualize that, that often looks like a characteristic of the culture. So you might start to see, oh, well, like Natives are just drunks. They're just alcoholics. That's just the way they are. That has been a coping mechanism for Native people since white contact, essentially. And so when we think about intersectionality, especially in the Indigenous community, we all sort of have a baseline understanding, especially in intentional laws put in by the federal government, of why we come in with so much trauma. So we sort of have the community, the family-based trauma. Then you move on to the sort of the micro level, the personal trauma of, I was raised with an abusive family. I was in the foster system. I was taken away from my family. I never got to be engaged in my culture, which is a very specific Native concern and intersectionality. But essentially, I see intersectionality as, just recognizing that every single person is up against their own demons, and that we need to treat them as humans, and that the situation that they are in is a failure of our system and not a personal failing of that person. I also did just want to expand on your point really quickly, Mikayla, about maternal health for Native women. Our neighbor to the north right now in so-called Canada is going through several cases in whatever their equivalent of the Supreme Court is, because they are still sterilizing Native women up north. This is something that was caught in the U.S. in like the 50s, 60s, when Native women would go in for primary care. Their providers would sterilize them, essentially to end the Indian problem, and that has been a practice very, very commonly across the U.S. and in Canada. It is particularly bad right now. So even in contemporary cases, we do not have agency very often over our bodies to even decide to be mothers.
Thank you for that. So I don't go from trauma to trauma. I'm sorry. I wanted to touch on violence against women. I know that a lot of people here have personal stories. The Me Too movement brought some of the stories to the collective consciousness, but it seems to have been fading from the collective consciousness. Although I think if you ask a room of women, it's never very far from our thought processes. I wanted to ask, though, if you think, and this is for any panelist, if you think that the Me Too movement and some of that awareness has resulted in any changes in policy or practices, and where should efforts and funding be targeted to have the most impact so that that doesn't fade completely from the collective consciousness?
Well, it's a bit of an oversimplification to say that many of the skills that are around consent are actually acquired and mastered during early childhood. But it's not that much of an oversimplification to say that that is true. And that's one of the problems with an undertrained, undersupported, high turnover workforce. The very skills that we want to see people gain for solid communication, being able to say what you want in words, being able to recognize when you're having a feeling and not just act out on it. We would have really different fraternities and law firms if we had really different preschools, right? I mean, again, that feels like an oversimplification, but it's the truth. And if you look at the kinds of programs that folks with means secure for their own children, the kind of care that folks with means secure for their own children, we really have a responsibility to never stop working for an equitable access to trauma-informed, culturally responsive, personalized, and nurturing care for our littlest people. And that means that the people who surround those folks, including parents, and I'm talking about parental leave in that mix, as well as settings where children spend their day if their parents are working, parents should have the option to choose how their children are cared for and to make sure that those settings are great. Clearly, the learning process doesn't end when children turn 5, but we are much further along the road if children have had a solid opportunity to master some of those executive function skills in an environment that's ready for them.
I said I wasn't going to talk about MMIR, and then I'm here, so I'm going to do it. I'm also going to make a shameless plug. On Saturday, All Nations is hosting a 5K at the Paddlehead Stadium specific to our MMIR survivors and families of people who have been impacted. All of that funding goes right back into our community. All Nations doesn't make a dime off that. So if you want to run or walk on Saturday for a 5K, we are out there. I hate to data dump on people, but I think it's the most efficient way to convey sort of the seriousness of violence in the Native community against women. Specifically, I'm going to start with that 98% of violence perpetrated against Native women is by non-Native men. Shocker, maybe. I'll also say that, Native women experience violence, domestic violence, and sexual assault explicitly 10 times the national average. 10 times. The third highest cause of death for Native women, homicide. Being murdered is the third most likely reason that a Native woman will die. 1 out of 2 women, there's a 50% chance, 1 out of 2 Native women that you know have experienced some amount of violence or sexual assault. That is huge. Those are gigantic numbers. I mean, I can think of people off the top of my head that I'm like, and for me, that rings true as well. It just is insane, the amount of, I think, oversimplification that gets in our mainstream life. And so I wanted to talk specifically about MMIR because I don't know if you guys remember, it was probably 18 months ago, maybe 2 years now, the Gabby Petito case. Is this ringing? I'm seeing some nods. About this young white woman from Florida, I think, who... she was in a national park. Anyway, she was murdered by her boyfriend. And that got national news like so quickly. Like everybody knew about it. It was like all over Facebook and Instagram. That is such a common thing in Native families that it doesn't get any mainstream attention. I feel like here in Montana, because we have such a large Native population, you hear a little bit more about it. But at really the mainstream level, it's completely glossed over. And so when you see one white woman who was, tragically killed by her boyfriend, gets so much attention, it's really hard to sit back as a Native person and say, okay, but my auntie, but my cousin, but my mom. There are so many instances in the Native community where we have to go and do that that outreach and the working with tribal and federal law enforcement to get anything done. And so often there are so many intentional barriers placed in the path of justice for Native women that it's a very defeating process. And so to see all of the news coverage and the resources go to this girl, I mean, great that we found out what happened to her, but you cannot throw a stone and hit a Native person and they wouldn't be impacted by MMR. That is how big this issue is.
Do you see any, I don't know, any organizations supporting survivors or any programs that are moving the needle? I mean, when Grace says early child care, she's not wrong. I mean, I giggled a little when she first said it, but prevention, right? Like when we start with somebody in preschool, that can have an impact 20, 25 years from now. What can we do to have an impact today? Mikayla, if you want to answer that too, that's fine.
I always tell people first, you need to understand tribal sovereignty and you need to understand tribal laws. Because what she is saying is real. There's a law, correct me again if I'm wrong. If a act of violence is committed on tribal land, they cannot be charged. That's a problem. Billings, Montana is one of the most dangerous places for Native women right now. That's a problem. So I'd really, other than U of M and MSU, they have the Voice Center. I don't know what you all have here. What do you have at the school here?
Sark, yeah, there's a sexual assault resource center.
And other than the indigenous organizations, I don't see any other organizations working on these issues. How can you fix a problem if you don't even see it?
Right. I think in Missoula, our YMCA is doing, YWCA. Thank you, Julie, is doing work in this area as well. But
I was just going to say, as far as organizations that are helping with this, All Nations Health Center, that grant that was read in my bio, Project Beacon, is an initiative geared specifically towards our Native women, helping their families who have been impacted by the murder of their daughter, Auntie Kukum Grandma, and also helping survivors. And so, as you can imagine, as a Native organization, we provide that culturally competent care, culturally competent resources, and that helps bridge gaps for our Native people in ways that nothing else does. I mean, that trust that you already are being taken care of by someone from your community with similar lived experiences, that makes a huge difference in the health of our community.
okay, we are going to be interrupted in just a minute with another announcement that the library is closing. But I would love to have questions from our members. Does anybody have anything that they would like to ask our panelists? Oh, I can. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Does anybody have a question for our... Yep. I see some hands. I'm coming with the microphone. Oh, with you.
Skye, this is probably most for you, but what is this intersectionality, I don't know if this is the right word or not, that's kind of a new one for me, but why are these indigenous women so devalued that they are abused and murdered? Where is the cause of that needs to change?
Racism.
Oh, okay.
But I caught it really quickly. Yeah, racism. All of the nuances of racism. There's this thing that we call in the Native community, like the Pocahontas effect. Of, when you think of Pocahontas, she was like this beautiful, regal Native princess. She was a 14-year-old girl who was taken away from the only homeland and the only people that she had known to die tragically of a colonizer's disease far away from her home. And that perpetuation of this like Native princess, like the ethereal, different ethnicity, I don't know, for some reason that just perpetuates this like demand in sex trafficking and in murdering. And so I think that undervaluing is just simply people not seeing other people as people. And then just sort of driving that narrative of, a lot of people think, Just so you know, the library's closed. We are not, but the library is. But yeah, I think you just see this devaluing across, the different centuries, the different decades that this empire has existed here in America. That's not how we treat each other as Native people or as Indigenous people generally. So I think a lot of it has to do just sort of with this colonizer aspect of, I'm out for me, nothing is the collective, and just sort of, throwing that human life away because it benefits you.
That our systems, especially when talking about childcare and healthcare, they're built up to be these screeners, right? Especially for marginalized demographics. So I think a huge shift that needs to happen is the language needs to change so that when you drop a child off, it's not a screening tool to say, what is this parent not doing versus what can we do for that parent, right? And same with healthcare. If an Indigenous woman shows up to get prenatal care and it's 22 weeks, instead of shaming her and saying, we're going to flag you and potentially get Child Protective Services involved, we should be doing, great, you made it here today. What do we need to send you home with so you can make it back? And what other resources? Yep. So
Go, Steph.
I think the challenge is we need to start looking at our language and our screening tools and all of that to make it more all-inclusive, to start backpedaling from all the racism that exists. That wasn't a question. That's just a soapbox.
I know I was going to say, Steph, do you want to just join us? Can we just pull a chair up for Steph?
Kathy, you had a question.
I thank you all for being here and being so articulate about your passions for these causes. To build on, I think, really both those questions, I'm curious if you think that what is happening now is an accurate reflection of society's values at this moment in time, or if it's simply that we created a system and changing the system is like a really hard, to change, to steer the ship in a different direction is very difficult.
So one really hard truth that I found myself telling my 15-year-old the other day is that we are what we do and not what we say we're going to do. And I think that's our national crisis and struggle as well. We say we stand for a lot of things. We say that we value children and that we think children are the most important gift from, wherever we think they come from. And everything that we do sends the opposite message. Children are exploited and commodified and under-resourced and undervalued until they can produce economically in this nation. So we got a lot of work to do.
Any other questions? Oh, yep. Oh.
Mikayla, this question is for you, and I'm just wondering, why are gynecological issues for BIPOC women increasing? Is it like the concern or the racism that they see within the healthcare that's stopping them from even going to get treatment at this point, or why is it increasing?
They're not listening to women of color. There's an article about an Olympian just died. And then there was an article about Serena Williams, one of the greatest tennis players of our time, having to argue with doctors about she needed a heparin drip. And they were like, well, no, you don't. And she's like, I know my body. I just think that for some reason there's some type of compassion missing in the healthcare system. There's some type of bedside manner. There's discrimination. And what Skye was talking about earlier, the sterilizations. A lot of doctors who work at IHS are white doctors, and they are going in there, believe they already have the power, so there's a power imbalance, and they're pushing their beliefs of what they think people's families should look like. We just have a lot of work to do in our healthcare systems.
I will say, too, from my work with the Ovarian Cancer Research Alliance, one of the things, and there's research going on this, I don't know that I can give you real statistics, but there is some concern, especially in the American South, that rates of uterine and ovarian cancer are rising because Black women are allowed to keep their reproductive organs, whereas for decades, hysterectomies were recommended for women of what color specifically at times when they weren't necessary. Because you won't, forced sterilization maybe, right? Somebody else had a hand up. Oop.
It seems like education and awareness plays a part in all of your roles. How are you guys using social media, knowing the rise and the continued rise of social media? How are you guys using that to like spread the work you're doing and the messages and what needs to be done?
Okay. I would say for the Native community, Facebook is like our thing. Like that is like our social media place where you get all your news, you get all your gossip. Like Facebook is the place. You find out things you didn't even know about yourself from Facebook that somebody else posted. At All Nations, we use a variety of different social media website. There's a Medicaid commercial going around out there as well from us. But really what we do is, the social media on Facebook, and then we're also starting a podcast, which is also really big with our Native community. There's a couple of really great MMIR-specific podcasts out there that I could recommend. But it's just another way to sort of open that accessibility portal because you don't even have to have like the Spotify subscription that you pay for. You can just listen to podcasts wherever, and that's a big barrier is always typically the cost for our Native community. I would say typical like social media for the Native community doesn't work super well because of access to like TV and internet. There's like no broadband available on like any reservation in Montana. So a lot of it is like word to mouth. So if you have like a really great positive experience with someone, like you're gonna go home and you're gonna tell your cousins and your family. Same thing, if you have a bad experience, you're gonna tell every single person that you know, don't go to them, don't do that. So I would say there's a lot of just like building trust and relationship that kind of carries our news and our rapport with people that does a better way than like a Facebook ad or like a radio ad.
Okay. There was another hand over here somewhere. Yep.
Hi, it's my first time here, so I'm honored to be here and with such talent. Your question was amazing. It was a soapbox question, whatever. But as I'm listening to you guys, I'm seeing the intersectionality between all the issues that you're talking about. That's very interesting. And what I'm hearing is increased vulnerability that's hitting people that are the most vulnerable. I don't think we think about family care and self-care and spiritual care and community care and emotional care in a holistic way, almost like a social worker. We're only as strong as the most vulnerable among us. I'm concerned as a human being that those that are the most vulnerable are at increased risk. How do we change that trend? I think it's interesting. You had a very interesting idea in terms of how we do that. The idea of a patchwork quilt, I absolutely love that analogy, and how we create networks of care and networks of compassion and networks of empathy to counter this. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I think how we start is learning how to have conversations again. We don't know how to talk to each other. Even people who have a different perspective than we do, we just start yelling and we're not having a conversation. When I teach a class and I tell my students, I'm not trying to change your mind. I'm not trying to change who you are, but I do want you to be open to a different perspective because we all have something to learn from each other. It just really starts with just having open conversations again.
Well, I think that families, when they're at their most vulnerable, are families in that period of life where they've got very little children, and they're also the hardest to find at that point because unlike once they're in school, there's no central way to connect with them with a message. And so that sort of quilt of care across the community is extremely important, and the folks who work with those children and families are often working in silos that aren't very well connected together. And so over the past few years here in Missoula, there have been some significant investments in trying to knit that all together differently. Both the common good effort that's brought folks together around mostly the issue of housing, but some other things too. And then 0 to 5 is actually part of a systems change effort funded by Headwaters. Erin Switowski was meant to be your panelist tonight from Headwaters, but she is ill, and so I'm really grateful that I got to step into that. And the project that I work with was funded as part of a systems change effort that recognized the folks who are trying to provide care for the vulnerable are not well connected to each other. So they're not all talking the same language. They're not all understanding what each other do. They're not all striving toward the same goals. They're not all leveraging resources well together. Everyone's sort of fighting for the same grants. And so that systems work, which is kind of invisible sometimes and kind of hard to see, it is really starting to pay off, but it's really long-term work to build those systems and look for those ways to work together better, not starting new things, but making the old ones work as better geared systems.
Y'all feel free to take this mic out of my hand. I feel like I've just been talking this whole time. I have a lot of opinions, if you can't tell. I just wanted to piggyback off something that you said earlier, Mikayla. I think systems change really comes when you listen to the communities that are most deeply impacted by the system, right? And that's what happens so often. I don't think the Native community is unique in this aspect, but so many people come in saying, we know what you need. We observe this thing. Here is a resource. Which is great, thank you, but it isn't the thing that we know we need. We know our needs the most. We are experts on our own experience, and we know how to make that change more than someone making a casual observation about our community. So when you go to that community and you listen to their needs, and even if it is in direct misalignment with what you think that community needs, listen to them. Provide the resources, whatever that is.
Quick question. So, as someone that tries to advocate and be a voice for marginalized demographics, specifically with women and children, to break down some of the barriers with racism, there's giving rationale, right? So I think of like health equity and saying, sure, women of color have higher rates of diabetes. And then that's a period, instead of it being because we suppress them so they were getting less access to nutritional food, right? So there's this tension for me as a leader sometimes to like give that rationale without making a vulnerable population feel more of that weight of that statement. And I'm curious, as leaders that also try to represent women and empower them, how do you find that balance where you're not giving them more of that stereotype, but still trying to actively break down those barriers?
It is on, okay. I can explain this in an example. So I did graduate from Little Bighorn College and moved on, and then I came back. I came back as an outsider and as a researcher. And my time at Little Bighorn, I remember during the summer, we were having a session, and they were talking about assimilation. I had no idea the California school system is trash. I'll just be very honest. But just sitting there and listening and them just being so vulnerable in something that's very traumatic and painful, I really do think that it comes down to listening, and the community will tell you what they need. And that's all I can really say.
Strengths-based approach. That's what I would say. Again, I'm going to reflect this on the Native community. We get told all the time, what's wrong with us? We know. We're aware. We live in those families who have those health disparities. We know why we have high rates of diabetes and cardiovascular disease and alcoholism. We know. We're aware. We know it's a bad thing. Emphasize our strengths, which is why I started, my initial conversation with, we can talk about oppression all day. We all know that exists. Yes, it's important to highlight it, but we don't often enough highlight our strengths and our wins, and we don't celebrate those enough. And so we should do that for our community is yes, and we understand that you are bringing all of these experiences to the table. However, you are so resilient that you made it this far. Like, let's keep cultivating that. So I think having that real conversation based in a strengths-based approach is how I would navigate that.
Don, you had your... Grace, did you have something to add?
I'm not sure because I think you just answered my question. That like I had, I'm gonna try and phrase this in a question instead of getting on a soapbox with my friend Steph here. But you know, I think it's so important. I have the privilege of doing some work with some different organizations, and one of them in particular is a perinatal substance use network out of the county. We're not applying, so I can talk about it. And one of the things to talk about is trauma-informed, trauma-engaged, whatever that language is, and what does that mean? But here's the thing. It's one thing to talk about we need to do something, kind of like when the George Floyd incident happened. My beautiful niece Abby was just a mile from where that occurred, and it had a significant effect on her. So we get all these movements that get attention, but then what has changed, really? So we talk about this, and we create new buzzwords, you know, instead of homeless now, and I'm a former homeless person, so I feel okay saying this language, but I used to be homeless. Now I would be called unhoused or unsheltered, but what is being done? So when I think about the Women's Giving Circle, and I think about this year, we have a $10,000 grant. I want you to notice we're saying this year, because we are possibly going to be changing our grant amount for next year. So very exciting. Yeah, to more. And in a way that's sustainable over time, because collectively we come together. We are stronger together. And what I've heard each of you say in many different ways is we need to get louder, but not louder like we get bigger and tougher and buffer, because I know how to do that, believe it or not, I do. But how do we get more active with our compassion, our conversations, our understanding? So instead of me going to Skye, I want to give all nations I don't. I wish I could. I would. But I'm going to give all nations $1 million. But here's what you need to do to solve your problem. And then that brings us into a whole nother conversation. So I don't know, that actually was a soapbox. But here I got a question. So my question is this. So this year, so the purpose of this panel is to blow our minds, which you're doing quite well, thank you. And you too, Miss Molly. But also to get us thinking about, because soon, I want to make sure you're all invited to our November 9th finalist presentation. You do not need to be a member to attend, so you're welcome. But you do need to be a member to vote. So if you want to vote, you know, we'll talk about that later too. But how do we, what do we think about listening to Grace, listening to all of this? And I also like the quilt. How do we increase our collective impact with this $10,000 grant? What would be some things that you think would be super impactful? Or at least make the needle at least do a little.
Okay, so I'm excited to answer this one, so I'm going to go ahead and talk about that if you want, because collective impact is kind of my jam. The work that I've been doing over the past 4 years has been all about trying to see systems and facilitate an emergent network, which means that no one designs a network, right? That it emerges out of lots of different people and organizations doing things differently because of the conversations that we've had, because of the work that we've done together over here and over there. And then when you pull back up to that 20,000-foot view, the whole system looks different because of those pieces. So the impact of the gift that y'all will make is not about the gift, really, right? The impact is in your heart and your mind and the conversations that you have, you in this room, going and having conversations with other people that are informed by what you've learned about the needs in the community. All of the organizations who ask for this gift will probably change the heart and mind and knowledge base of some of you, and you'll go out as more empowered folks to do those conversations elsewhere. And you're building that sense of informed, impassioned urgency, right? If a $10,000 gift was going to change the world, we'd have a changed world. But a $10,000 gift is about the process that you pull together to understand your community better and get a little braver in the conversations that you have with people who maybe haven't talked about intersectionality, haven't talked about racism, haven't talked about the structural problems behind childcare, haven't talked about any of these things, right? So it's really on what you all make of this process and this gift that the collective impact happens. It's not about finding a magic grant that's doing all of the things that you want to see, because I will tell you that there is no project that is going to change this community for $10,000. But you all are changing this community with your $10,000, if that makes sense.
No, that was great.
So as we start to wrap up, I did want to give a shout out to the Missoula Community Foundation for something that they are doing, and this reflects a lot on what John had to say. There's a movement within the fundraising world and the philanthropy world about transparent philanthropy, and I wanted to also give everybody a homework assignment. There's a great nonprofit leader, consultant in Seattle. His name is Vu Lee. Last name is L-E. He has a blog called Nonprofit AF, and has written some amazing things on decolonizing philanthropy. That read would be great to have in your mind as you're thinking about the grants that we're going to be deciding on here in a month or so. I did want to give our panelists one more opportunity to speak. Outside of your realm of expertise, you are all women. Are there other women's issues that we haven't talked about tonight that you would like us to think about?
When I worked at MTREP, one of the big things that I was working on was a program called My Voice, My Choice, and we would talk about reproductive justice issues. And one thing that I want everyone to, if take anything from this, go and research what a shield law is. And it's something I think that Montana needs to develop. So a shield law is basically a law that is put in place for people who come over to our state who do not have access to abortion care. They will not be arrested. They will not be harassed. They will not be arrested going back to their state. Yes, we do have abortion access here in Montana. I've said that, and in Wyoming. But if you think of all the other states around us, that's a lot of people. And then also thinking about our Native communities, because abortion access that's not an option for them.
I guess maybe by way of, thank you for that, and maybe by way of sharing a resource, I would suggest that if you haven't read The Body is Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor, you should. Not an Apology. Among many of its fantastic lessons is the idea that weight doesn't equal health, and health doesn't equal value as a human person. So that is something I care about.
And I guess I just want to harken back to our opening about who counts as a woman. That conversation, I think, as we all know, is ever evolving. Our language is changing what feels like every day. I want to provide some grace to all of us that none of us are able to keep up with that all of the time. We're going to make mistakes, and that is okay. It is okay to do that. It is better to learn from those mistakes than to double down on your mistake. But I want to especially elevate our Two-Spirit community here in Montana. If you aren't familiar with the term Two-Spirit, highly recommend doing a quick Google search. But I think it's important that we continue to have those conversations around who counts as a woman, the continual flexibility between, sexual identities and expressions, and just being really open to that and knowing that I guess that a woman can be any person, anyone, and we can decide to not be women at any point. So just being really open to that conversation, which again is ongoing, I know, and can sometimes be confusing with our new lexicon that seems to change every day, but just opening your hearts and your mind to having those conversations and to being wrong.
Yes. All right. Oh, Dawn, I think, has another announcement or. All right.
So this is the Women's Giving Circle panel. We are for women and non-binary individuals, and we'll keep working on that. And there is no shame in my game, so I am good with making lots of mistakes. I do. 52 mistakes daily makes an awesome human being, as long as you like get about 40 of them new ones. And the others look different. But anyways, I want to make sure if you have any question, if you're not a member of the Women's Giving Circle and you have any questions about the Women's Giving Circle, we'll be hanging out here. Like I said earlier, because I was supposed to do a little spiel, but I'm, whatever. Part of my charm, part of my challenge. But we are here. Jamie is here. Molly is here. Katie is here. I thought I saw Kim right in front of my face. And then Marcy Allen, who's and Kathy's here. So we have a few of the steering committee members, Veronica and Ginger. Oh, there's Ginger. Okay. So there's plenty of people here if you have any questions, if you're curious about us. But what I want to say, besides thank you to our amazing panelists, mind-blowing, so grateful we did. Good job, Jamie. This in-person event. But I really want to thank Molly for moderating. And yeah, thank you.